Welcome back, everyone, to Pontos Fathom Press. This is our Pontos Fathom podcast, episode 65, and we are continuing with part 2 of our Mysterium Coniunctionis walkthrough. We've got Edinger's Mysterium lectures on the table, Professor Edinger's journey through C.G. Jung's Mysterium Coniunctionis. We've got the original final work by Jung, this massive conjunction of the opposites and the mystery within that. Actually, there's a quote from Edinger on the back of the book. It says, "What Jung has to convey is so truly original and far-ranging in its implications that I suspect this book will be a real challenge even to those most psychologically sophisticated. What he presents in rich, documented detail can perhaps be described as an anatomy of the objective psyche. Broadly speaking, it is a treasury of images pertaining to the individual's discovery of the self. It is a splendid capstone to the life work of a master spirit." I think what's my intuition about this work and the way we've been presenting this from part 1 of our lecture and then following through in this podcast, episode 65, we're calling today's talk Jung as an occultist. So we've got Aleister Crowley also on the table here. And last time we talked a little bit just about, I think we worked through the beginning, a few chapters of Mysterium Coniunctionis. The first parts we talked about were just the idea of nature puts things in forms of opposites. And then those opposites in turn create a sort of a fourfold imagery, which Jung sort of just describes as this. So sort of like the idea of space opens up by the nature of the opposing opposites, sort of like the I Ching. It starts with heaven and earth, and you get fire and water, and before you know it, you have the world. So this sort of demarcates that space. But one interesting thing that I did notice, I also want to look at things in 2 or 3 different levels, right? So in one way, I remember Terence McKenna once wrote that he was most interested in the books by Jung that the Jungians ignored. That was probably in the 90s he said that. And I think what he was talking about were books like Mysterium Coniunctionis, Alchemy, Psychology and Alchemy, and Alchemical Studies, maybe Aeon as well. Like those are the books that Jung's later works where he gets really involved with alchemy, and less about the collective unconscious and more just about the what I want to call something that's more akin to occult thinking. And I think this is where there's maybe there's a disclaimer here. The way to think of things is I think that Jung purposefully didn't publish books like his Red Book, like his Liber Novus, or the Black Books. We've done some podcasts on the Black Books as well. I think he intentionally didn't publish those works because he hadn't quite figured out what to do with them from a clinical reason. But at the same time, I maybe just want to, what do I know? I'm just a guy, right? But I kind of feel that maybe there's something about a fork where the occultist Jung was sort of at odds with the psychological Jung. And the way I want to talk about this is even, I've got a couple of other books on the table. I've got Alone of All Her Sex, The Myth and the Cult of the Virgin Mary here, as well as I also got this book, Steegman's 2,000 Years of the Resurrection of Lazarus in Art. And I just put these out there on the table, and I oddly noticed some kind of strange thing. So just the way we can look at things from the point of view of a depth psychologist or a Jungian psychologist, which has to do with a psychological view, which should also ultimately be aligned with psychology, should ultimately be aligned with, when it comes to individuals, the betterment of that person's ability to have agency over themselves in the world, to understand themselves, to interact with others, to have a good life, these kind of things. The nature of psychology as a health tool. But I think there's part of Jung that was, while he was quite motivated by that side, I think there was a part of him that leaned toward the more abstract version. And just like Edinger's quote on the back of the book, he wanted to see the self as a cosmological experiment. He wanted to be an experiencer. There's a sort of side of him that, and this is why I align it with this Crowley, which is, it almost leans into something preternatural or even magical, if you would go so far. And the way we can stack that is, I actually have a friend's dream that we're going to talk about a little bit later. I've got this dream about the way I wanted to interpret this dream, both from a psychological point of view and then also from a experiencer point of view, let's call it. But I did have this one interesting note. So I took these books and I noticed we had the Bollingen. So right, we're going to talk about the contents of the books, but then just from see this Bollingen symbol? It's a quaternary symbol. We were just talking about the rounded circle, right? We just talked about how the cross becomes the domain circle of the fourfold, the quaternary. Then I noticed that this 2,000 Years of Lazarus art also has a hospitalier cross on it. Obviously, crosses and circles are symbols that people use. But then again, this Alone of Her Sex, although it does have the sun logo, it also has this small cross in a circle. And then, just when I thought the Edinger book didn't have one, I turned it on the side, and there is the X in a square, in a circle. So what does this say? Well, it says that there's lots of information out there in the world. So if we look at those four logos, right, just looking at the books themselves, you've got the Inner City books, you've got the Bollingen series from Princeton, you've got this Hospitalier symbol from the Resurrection of Lazarus book, and then you've got this kind of Christian cross in a circle circumscribed. But then we have the Crowley book. So we've got the 4, and then we have the 5, which is the pentacle, and then the 6, which is this, I forgot what they call it. It's a continuous, you can draw this hexagram with a single line, just like we could draw a star with a single line. This is the hexagram that you can draw with a continuous line without lifting the pen. And then we have the heptagram, whatever this is, the 7-sided star. And I sort of reproduced these again here. What I thought was interesting about these were the number of intersections there are. So where a cross intersects, in a single X, a pentacle has 5 X's that create this portal around the pentagram. This has 7, this has 7, 6 or 7, depending on how you want to count them, how you count these intersections. So I thought that was just something to kind of call out. And actually Jung, in the Mysterium Coniunctionis, is talking in this section, we're going to talk about the paradox, right? The paradoxical. Edinger has an interesting image that he shares of this paradoxical, of the black sun. So I think it came from a dream of a patient of Jung's. So here we have the night sky mandala, again, a quaternary quadrant of the sky. And then there was I want to share that image that I came across here, of the rays of the sun. That was a dream of one of Jung's patients, I believe. Here we go, the square. Now we've got the points of the compass here. I lost this. Here we go. The sun and the shadow, right? So here we have this painting called The Black Sun. And it says, in the midst of the symbolism of soul, we learn not only as its association to the deity and the creative source of fire and life, but it also has many parallels with hell and the devil. So there is the black sun. Not only are there bright sun rays, but also dark sun rays. I have a painting done by a patient of mine. This is actually Edinger talking. At the Rockland State Hospital. There isn't time to go into details of the case. The patient had a psychotic break. By the time I was seeing him, he was compensated. This is the final picture of a series that he did. The quaternary Mandela-like image. The patient specifically stated it was the sun. He had written sunbeam in 4 different languages. It's a funny looking sun emitting so much blackness as light. So here again we have this sort of, right, the black sun. As Jung tells us in paragraph 117, the basic meaning of soul is consciousness, and yet part of the symbolism of consciousness is blackness. Here's an example of this phenomenon dreamt by a black professional woman. The woman was caught in a bright searchlight and was being accused of a crime. The evidence of her guilt was she was cast a black shadow on the ground when in the field of this bright searchlight. As Jung mentioned, we don't literally see black sun rays streaming from the sun. Wherever a material object interposes itself in the pathways of light, the shadow doesn't exist unless a substantial object blocks the light and the shadow is created. This is kind of a Jungian reading of that, right? So anyway, let's kind of go into, I want to just sort of share that. Let's sort of go into the paradox. So we begin with, Jung is talking about the sort of alchemical paradoxes, the black, the white, the red, the yellow. The principles of the art is the raven that flies without wings, and to make Mercury within Mercury is the chemical wedding. And he kind of goes off into this direction, talking about the prima material of water. We also have some mentions here of John Dee. I think if you look at John Dee, he also has his monad hieroglyphicus, right? So John Dee's John Dee book, does it have it does have these 4 symbols, but it does have a cross at the top, and it actually has an ankh here. So we're in the trend, right? So the Monas Hieroglyphicus, I think it's in this book, I have it, is Dee had created a symbol that was made up of all of the planetary symbols into one symbol. So it has the circle of Mercury, it has the cross, it has the scythe of Saturn, and the elbow there of Jupiter, all mixed into one symbol. I don't have it in this book. This is not, the Monas Hieroglyphicus is not in here. But there are a number of similar. Here's the 7-pointed star. And here's the Dr. Dee's wax sigil, where again you can see similar to this, where there's the pentacle, there's the circle, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. There's a 7-sided star, and then there's also a 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 gets inscribed into this. So he's got this quite mapped out. So the 4 becomes the 5, the 6, and the 7. I guess is sort of where we're going with that. But maybe we can, if we go back to the text here, Dr. Dee comes in. So he's talking about the world egg, the germ of the egg in the yolk, the physics of Genesis, the wisdom of God when the creative word with the huge machine of the world, the Mysterium Coniunctionis. Maybe it's kind of like the chicken and the egg problem, right? Which came first, the chicken or the egg? The old saying, right? Without the chicken, there's no egg. Without the egg, there's no chicken. There's the mysterious in conjunction, right? That's the Mysterium Coniunctionis, right? The integration. We also have Democritus talking about the sun point and Sapientia, the twice bisected circle representing Jerusalem. God is one essence, the unity of God. It goes into the scintilla. So we're in paragraph 42 here. Let's check about this. Paragraphs 31 to 41. starts talking about Manichaeanism. What's interesting about Manichaeanism is how Manichaeanism is, I think we left off with this last time. Manichaeanism as a philosophy was sort of the idea that God isn't over the devil. It's like God and the devil are both equal valences, and that the world sort of is the conflict between these two forces, right? And so that anthropos sits in the middle of the circle. You know, you think of the Vesuvian man there, the man circumscribed within the circle, who's also a pentacle, right? So what Edinger says about this is the Mani was a founder of Manichaeanism. Mani is a quite important figure to the Western psyche, even though we never have heard of him, because he's the shadow figure of the collective consciousness. Ever since Augustine, who lived and functioned about a century after Mani, he's been saddled with the projection of evil. Augustine was a Manichaean until he converted to Christianity. So this idea of switching from the Manichaean was considered a heresy, right? So the idea is, at first the idea was we must walk the path between good and evil. And then that just turned into, there's only one God, right? So they didn't like the idea that there was an evil God, right? Mani's doctrine said the contrary. Mani asserted that evil had the same degree of reality as the principle of which substances as to the good. So you can see why Augustine was so against him. But Augustine is one of the creators of the collective Christian psyche, and hence, for that particular psychic manifestation, Mani is the arch-heretic and the personification of evil himself. The reason for this is he acknowledged the reality of evil. It's an early illustration of the profound psychological fact that whenever someone sees the reality of evil and points it out and makes an issue of it, hey, look at that. The person runs the grave risk of being identified by the collective psyche with the evil thing being pointed out. This is very interesting, right? So and I think this will kind of come back in when we bring this Alone of All Her Sex, the myth and the cult of the Virgin Mary, because this is the same backlash that Marina Warner, as a second-generation feminist, sort of got again from the Catholic Church. And I think that a reasonable person looking at this, written in the 70s today, I think what she was just talking about is very common. It's just common sense. But at the time, it seemed to have an anti-Catholic sort of view to it. As depth psychologists, it's the very nature of our profession to deal with the unconscious, the regions below. And again, the circle here, again, we can split this Manichaean circle in the Jungian terms. If you take that Manichaean circle and you say that there's a good and an evil, if there's a break, actually we can just use this symbol for now. Above this line could be seen as the conscious, and below this line can be the unconscious. Jung sought to map out that unconscious and conscious interaction space. And one of those features of the Jungian unconscious was the shadow. And this inner world of shadow work came out of that Jungian analysis, let's call it. Okay, so let's go into this Manichaean a bit more. In the beginning of the Manichaean myth, there were two natures, two whole worlds of the beginning, the world of light and the world of darkness. And a lot of this comes from Han Jonas's book, The Gnostic Religion, which I think we have here as well. Hans Jonas's book, Gnostic Religion. Let's see if we have Manichaeanism in here. Valentinian systems, Hermes Trismegistus. Let's look at the Manichaeanism in this book. Manichaeanism, there's the Mandaeans, there's the Manichaeans. Manichaean. Mani. So they have a whole chapter dedicated to this Zoroastrian dualism. of two co-eternal opposite principles which Mani takes for the point of departure. Mani is the only Gnostic system which became a broad historical force. So Mani is about what Steiner talks about in the separation of the light from darkness, and the idea here that Mani was born of Persian parents. His father seems to have been connected with the Baptist sect. He was quite possibly understood the Mandaeans or the Sabaeans, and the Manichaean hymn poetry show a distinct influence of Mandaean model. In the years of Ardash, king of Persia, I grew up and reached maturity. This is Mani, right? In that particular year, the living Paraclete came down to me and spoke to me. He revealed to me the hidden mystery that was hidden from the worlds and the generation, the mystery of the depth and the height. He revealed to me the mystery of the light and the darkness, the mystery of the conflict and of the great war which the darkness stirred up. Not the darkness of Justin Hawkins, just the darkness. He revealed to me how the light turned back and overcame the darkness by their intermingling, and how in consequence was set up this world. He enlightened me on the mystery of the forming of Adam, the first man. He instructed me on the mystery of the tree of knowledge, of which Adam ate, by which his eyes were made to see, the mystery of the apostles who were sent into the world and to select the churches. Thus he revealed to me the Paraclete that all has been. This reminds me of the way Philip K. Dick talks about the plasmate, the Paraclete. Though through him I learned to know everything and saw all through him and became one body and one spirit. So it's the separation of the light from darkness and also the balancing of the light from darkness. It's kind of like I want to say it's a discernment. So that before the existence of heaven and earth, everything were two natures, one good and one evil. Outside dwelt the five Shikanyas: intelligence, knowledge, thought, deliberation, and resolution. The evil principle is called the king of darkness, and he dwells in the lands of darkness, surrounded by his 5 aeons, the aeons of smoke, fire, wind, water, and of darkness. The world of light borders on that darkness, dividing the two, the Bar Konai. And the foundation of his teachings with the contradiction of the arch-principles, Mani's teaching began. The Persian Manichaeans, following the Zoroastrian tradition, called the personified darkness Ahriman, the Arabic sources archdevil or Iblis, corrupted from the Greek Iblis. The Greek source almost unanimously attach it to the term hyle, matter. And there can be no doubt that Mani himself in his writings, mostly Syriac, used this Greek term for the principle of evil. So here, we have some deep dive into the attack of the darkness, the world light, the primordial man, and the path of man is to sort of walk the line between the Manichaean and the. So again, here's one of the early paradoxes, right? And so then the wheel of light is the zodiac, and the zodiac is the great wheel that the sun traverses across the sky. In paragraph 34, Jung talks about, just as the Manichaeans, the sweat of the archons signified rain, for the alchemists sweat meant dew. And this is with the Acta Archeli, concerning the apparatus which the Son of the Living Father invented to save human souls. He constructed the great wheel with 12 buckets, where they scooped up the souls. They deposited them on the moon ship. In alchemy, the rota is the symbol of the opus circulatorum. Like the alchemists, the Manichaeans had a virago, the male virgin Joel, who gave Eve a certain amount of the light substance. So it was the light of all light and the Felis Philosophorum, the Mercurius duplex. I would not venture to decide how much of these parallels to be ascribed directly to the Manichaeans or how much indirect influence came from this. So this is kind of talking about Dorn and later thinkers influenced by the Manichaeans, Paracelsus. So we go on from the Manichaeans we go into, well, I guess we should stop here for one moment, just the image of the point. Again, we're talking about, maybe we're going back to my like the idea of the cross is a single point. So cross resolve in a point, right? So we can call this circle, this point, the cross resolve this. But you can see in these, actually beyond the point, no need for circumscription. We actually have a pentagon formed by these 5 points. So you create 5 points in a star formation, you get a space opens up. And similarly, the space opens up here. Actually, if you made this a simple hexagon, you'd have that space, but this is a twisted version of that. And I think Edinger goes into this. First, we learn about a point is when we study geometry. Plato defined a point as the beginning of the line, and the arche of that line, arche is the same word that is used for the prima materia and archons, or also in archaeology. Here's the illustration of the theorem. So a point can mark out 3 space by having the lines moving in the plane and then a plane crossing that plane, right? So the point sort of, this kind of goes into the Pythagorean concept that 1 wasn't a number, that 1 was more like the world, right? And even the Pythagoreans would symbolize the 1 as the symbol for the sun, the circle with the dot in it, which we've talked about is also a Saturn turned on its side. So let's go into the scintillae, which are the luminosities, the fiery sparks shining in the darkness, right? The oculi piscium, the fish's eyes, the eye of God, right? So the first of the major images that Jung continues in his Paradoxia is he talks about lights shining in the darkness. And Jung discusses this extensively in the important theoretical essay on the nature of the psyche, unconsciousness as a multiple consciousness. So he discusses this in that work as we know the foul earth quickly receives sparks. The sparks, Kunrath explains the radi attaki scintillae, the roots and its sparks of the world soul. Paracelsus seems to have an inkling thus, and as little as aught can exist in man without the divine numen, so little aught exists in man without the natural lumen. A man is made of both, perfect by numen and lumen, and these two alone. Without them, man is nothing. So it's sort of like soul and light. This really expresses in a nutshell the essential nature of the synthetic aspects of Jungian analysis. There's also a reductive aspect of analysis on the one hand and synthesis on the other hand. So I think this is where Edinger is going to sort of relate to Jung as a therapist, right? And how Jung would use the alchemy as a tool. But I think we also wanted to put forth this idea of Jung more like beyond the use of this as a therapeutic idea. He's calling out these paradoxes and these mysteries and paradoxes as an alchemical experiencer, I want to say. So it says here, the Egyptians held that the eye is the seat of the soul. For example, Osiris is hidden in the eye of Horus. In alchemy, the eye is the colum, the heaven. It is like an eye in seeing of the soul, whereby the state of the soul and her inventions are oftentimes made known to us, and through the rays and the glance of heaven all things are made. And we also have the idea of virtus is born out of the description of the Holy Ghost as an eye, a parallel to the invocation of Hermes. The eye, like the sun, is a symbol as well as an allegory of consciousness. Right? The alchemy of the scintillae are put together from the gold. Gold symbol is also that sun, that monad, the circle with the dot. So it is possible that the other unconscious complexes may possess as a splinter psyche a certain luminosity of their own. Very interesting. Let's keep going into this idea of the paradox. We'll kind of go into this thing about talking about life and death. So we start looking at this idea of life and death here. And he goes into the concept of what is this tomb? We reach the first positive statement. Mary's opinion is it has nothing to do with the tomb. There was no tomb. For she herself is the container, converting into herself the contained, and thus she is a tomb or a receptacle that has no body or content in it. It was said of Lot's wife, who was her own tomb without a body, and a body without a tomb. It's very, very interestingly, let's see, Edinger says on paragraph 64, the tomb, entrance to the tomb of Ramses III here. And it says, in the description, we're dealing with a tomb, and a tomb is a symbol of the unconscious. I would remind you, for instance, that the first illustration of men as his symbols is a tunnel going down into the tomb of one of the Egyptian pharaohs. The tomb of one thing signifies the world of the dead. It is also connected symbolically with the womb. Okay, so we've got this. Let's do a little pause here and talk about the mystery of the tomb and the womb. And let's have our candidates for discussion here to be the 2,000 years of the resurrection of Lazarus. That's very interesting because Lazarus, I believe that there are some, in the earliest this is from this gentleman, Stigman. Who knows where I found this book? He is a Dutch hospitalier of Saint Lazarus of Jerusalem. And it says, early representations of Lazarus are to be found in the catacombs. The Christians were greatly interested in Lazarus because he had risen from the dead. This meant that for them too, there would be a future life. The moment chosen for the whole gospel story was therefore of the resurrection of Jesus and Lazarus in a little temple. And then Mary and Martha also are there at the mountain peak. And then by the 19th century, you have Peter somehow joined. So they had the story of Lazarus. Someone was ill, one Lazarus from Bethany. It's from the Gospel of John, the village of Mary and her sister Martha. Mary's the woman who anointed the Lord with ointment. This is Magdalene Mary. And the sick Lazarus was her brother. The sisters sent him the message, Lord, he whom you love is ill. And when Jesus heard this, he said, the illness will not end in death. For has come the glory of God to bring the glory to the sons of God. Jesus loved Martha, her sister, and Lazarus very much. He hands on hearing the latter's illness. It's interesting how they admit that he didn't love Mary, right? Although he waited 2 days for this to take place. Let us go back to Jesus. Oh yeah, speaking of a synchronicity and Jesus loving Mary. So I'm doing the research for this the other day in the cafe, and then this Muzak song starts going. I realize I'm singing along to. It's the Jesus Christ Superstar, I Don't Know How to Love Him tune from... So Jesus Christ Superstar, they actually kind of did explore this idea of the relationship between Mary Magdalene and Jesus as a love relationship. But it was odd, like I knew this from like when I was a kid. I remember like a friend of mine, we went to Catholic school, and a friend of mine, Stephen, he had this album of Jesus Christ Superstar. And here I am doing this research on these, and that comes up. Jungian synchronicities, right? So it says... this nightfall he will stumble because the light falls him. These were his words, and he added, oh, our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but I shall go with thee and wake him. But master, if he has fallen asleep, will he recover? And Jesus, however, had been speaking of his death, but they thought he meant the rest of sleep. Therefore God spoke out plainly, Lazarus died for your good, and I am glad not to have been there so that you may believe. But let us go to him. So then they go to him, and Jesus said to her, your brother will rise again. And Martha replied, I know that he will rise again, the resurrection on the last day. And Jesus said to her, I am the resurrection and the life. If a man has faith in me, even though he die, he shall come to life. Whoever has faith in me shall never die. It's kind of interesting how there's a resurrection story inside of a resurrection story, right? And then they arrived at the tomb. And it says, Jesus started weeping, so that the Jews said, how dearly he must have loved him. But some of them said, could not he who opened the blind man's eyes have done something to keep Lazarus from dying? Oh, this is always that sneaky stuff, right? Jesus' critics saying, oh, he could make a blind man see, but he couldn't raise a man from the dead. So Jesus arrives at the tomb, take away the stone, and by now there was a stench, for he had been there for days. They removed the stone, and Jesus looked up and said, Father, I thank thee. And after these words, he raised his voice, Lazarus, come forth. And the dead man came out, his hands and feet swathed in linen. So, loose him and let him go. So Lazarus is raised from the dead by Jesus. But we see this, I just want to kind of take you through this tour that they've collected here. So they've got a number of images collecting. This is Lazarus as a poor man. Lazarus' resurrection. This is Lazarus, Jesus pulling him from the tomb. The sarcophagus in Rome about Lazarus. Another sarcophagus. In the Sabinus, Lazarus as a woman being raised from the dead. More sarcophagi featuring Lazarus. So obviously he becomes a detail. There again is Christ. He's coming out of the tomb. Here's the story in full as a brief. This is from Germany, 5th century. Jesus beholding Lazarus with his wrappings. Again, a French 6th century from Cluny. Lazarus in the doorway coming out wrapped. Again, Lazarus wrapped here like a mummy. Milan diptych from 420. Again, almost an Egyptian-looking detail here, right, of Lazarus. You see a cross in there. A Last Supper bowl. This is a 17th century version of Lazarus raising up. Lazarus coming out of a grave in this one. In the Catacomb of Saturnius, Vatican, we have this almost underground, it almost reminds me of a Mithraic version of the Lazarus story. A glass dish with Jesus, the Christos, and Lazarus is always dressed like a mummy. The Yugoslavian version of it, a stained glass version from the Netherlands and St. Urbanus, a Swedish painting from the 1500s. Again, Lazarus coming out of the tomb here, wrapped in the clothes. Oxford, UK, another Lazarus image. But you get the idea here. The raising of the dead. And this sort of has an Egyptian feel to it. So the tomb, let's go from the tomb to the womb. Again, here you have the Immaculate Conception of Mary. What's interesting about this book, I find very fascinating. I just mentioned it briefly. It's a great read because it is sort of like the cultural history of Mary. And it kind of goes all the way back to how, if we think about Mary, she comes out of a long tradition of women in these, Isis cults, Ishtar. There's always this goddess figure. But in the Christian myth, we didn't have really a place of a goddess. We only had a single god. So Mary sort of ends up carrying on this tradition of the woman. And I think Marina Warner took a lot of criticism for this book, but actually it's from the second wave of feminism, as I said in the beginning. The concept of it really is, she kind of has this reluctance, as a Catholic, she tells a lot of personal stories of how it's impossible for a woman to live up to the Catholic Virgin Mary concept. First of all, she's a virgin. She has God's child, right? And she's doesn't even die or decay. She assumes into heaven. So there's sort of like this odd model that you have for a woman. And then when you look at that quaternio and what Jung kind of speaks of in the balancing, or almost a Manichaean version of it, it's almost like the inverse reaction the other Mary gets, the Mary Magdalene gets, is she's reduced to a whore by the church fathers. Because it seems like you can't have human enjoiners of this. You can't have a modern view of it. It took all of this time to sort of weed this out and realize it. But one of the critiques this book, I believe it had, was that she was sapping Mary of her power, Warner, but from a Catholic point of view, when actually she's just calling out just human, just equal rights kind of concept, very simple concepts, you don't have to think of it as feminism today, maybe might have gone further with this idea. But I think in this case, it was mostly around the idea of the empowerment of, say, or just think of this, I think of it from a point of witchcraft, right? A woman's attachment to, say, these goddess cults ends up as witchcraft because it was threatening to some power structures, right? They didn't want people to have interpretations of these things. Look, even Galileo, right? Galileo was also kind of witch-trialed for having science, and women were witch-trialed for having intuition, basically. I mean, it comes down to that. And I think that's sort of the, here we have Mary having, with the baby, the Annunciation and early Annunciation. Obviously, Mary is almost like by Jupiter, impregnated, virgin birth, the whole thing. The Mater Dolorosa here, Giovanni Bellini's Pietà. The Magna Mater, the Great Mother, the Mater Dolorosa, the Assumption, how she goes to heaven, she's assumed back to heaven. So yeah, there's a lot of Mary lore out there. Very interesting if you want to see the history of Mary. It's a quite interesting book. So let's go back to the Mysterium Coniunctionis and just thinking of it in the context of Jung as a occultist. He comes against, next up is, we're going back to the tomb, the womb. So again, what is this about the tomb and the womb? So one thing that's interesting here is, we talked last time a bit about the chthonic, the idea of how the outer stars, the black outer stars. Now this is how we can get to this Crowley aspect of things, right? So the idea here is, what's the bridge between this tomb and womb, right? If we take this Mysterium Coniunctionis, let's just use it as an example, right? So in this example, you've got the outer firmament of stars. Let's look at John Dee's diagram here. This is where we see the stars and the planets moving out into this outer realm, the zodiac, right? So that outer realm is the blackness of the void, right? There's also a blackness inside of the under the ground, right? And I would say if we wanted to square this opposite, just let's be like Jung and Ion, right? When Jung starts creating those quaternaries, right? What if we were to put the tomb and the womb, and then we put just dying and being born, and we form this quaternary out of this, right? Well, while that is a cross, right? While this is sort of a fourfold, I think the fivefold is when we see that there's a mystery in there, and then we open up that new space, and we have this kind of view of it. The mystery there is there's a higher order that sort of connects in the living and dying as a continuum, right? There's a continuum. You know, we had that saying of people standing on the shores of a prior generation, right? So some of that intuition that Jung has, again, it's not only serving a psychological purpose, it's really just exploring, just like Crowley might do with his magic. You know, Crowley defines magic as anything you do in the world is magic. Action in the world is magic. So moving this is a kind of magic. It's emotion magic, you know. It's not just making something appear or some kind of spell. It's a much broader definition. And I think when Jung starts looking at the mechanics of the histories of religions with the unconscious, he starts to have a, and we actually call it today Jungian projection, but he starts to project into this space, this connectivity between the inside and the outside, which I believe is similar to thelema, or the law. You know, this is sort of like the will and one's action of the law, right? So this is something very interesting with Jung as an occultist. And I think maybe I'll pause here. One of the things that we in the introduction, actually some of this is covered in our book inside of PT2 Journals of Lovecraft's Providence. Balsamo's book on the necromancy of Nyarlathotep goes into these concepts sort of in detail. Like I think there's John D. There's a picture of John D. here. So the necromancy of Nyarlathotep sort of brings together this conjunction of living and dying, and the idea of resurrection, necromancy, reanimation. I think a lot of these themes I think they're confused. And what's nice about Jung's, both Jung's Mysterium Coniunctionis and the kind of work that someone like a Crowley was doing at the time was less about magic and less about psychology, I think, and more of a reckoning or a reconciling of the thousands of years of misinformation and broken hegemonies, to use the Rainer Schurman term of, it's like a system that never gets to fully develop. Like I think in his book, Broken Hegemonies, Schurman talks about just when the Greek project had been going, Greek fell to the Romans. And then just as the Roman project started going and we were making some progress, that turned into scholasticism. And as that was, as so above, so below, we got into we got into the humanism of the Renaissance, and then that moved into the science of the Enlightenment. And none of these projects actually get to finish. So each of the paths to realization sort of get curtailed, languages change, economic powers move to another nation. But I think one thing, too, that comes out of the correspondence between, let's say, Nyarlathotep and Egypt or something like this is if we go all the way back to the intro quote to the PT2 Journals, Colin Wilson quote from the beginning says, "For what it's worth, I would venture the opinion that the really important work on the Necronomicon will be carried out not by magicians, but by the followers of Carl Jung, who will regard it as a document describing so far unsuspected layers of the unconscious mind." So I think this is kind of where I feel Jung was going with this Mysterium Coniunctionis. Like he's going into the paradox, and he's looking at the depth of where this takes us. So we're talking about that idea of womb and tomb, and the idea of the connection here. He says the Latin translation serpent for witch is connected with the widespread primitive idea that the spirits of the dead are snakes. And it fits the offering of the goat's blood, since the sacrifice of black animals and the chthonic noumena were quite customary. In the Arabic text, the witches refer to the female demons of the desert, the jinn. And here we say, there is an earth near us, which is called Tormos, where there are serpents or witches that eat the darkness out of the burning stones. And on those stones they drink the blood of the black goats. And while they remain in the darkness, they conceive in the baths and give birth to the air and the stride of the sea. I'm going to do a podcast, speaking of baths, on when last time I was in Japan, I had a series of interesting encounters with a bath demon, one of the only temples, Shinto-type temples in Tokyo, that have the word demon not just Buddha or spirit. They actually used the word demon. It's one of a few temples, and it was about a bath demon and how they contained it. And this is a very interesting story. And then I'll share that with you in a future podcast. But this says the Arabic text, the witches refer to the female demons of the desert, the jinn. The grave haunting Numen is likewise a widespread idea that has lingered onto Christian legend. The dream of a 22-year-old theology student. I give this dream again so that those of my readers who are familiar with the language of dreams will be able to discuss the problem we are discussing. So he goes on to say, the dreamer was standing in the presence of a handsome old man dressed in black, which can be like the Nyarlathotep figure. He knew it was the white magician. Thus the personage had addressed him at considerable length, but the dreamer could no longer remember what was about. He called by closing words, "For this we need the help of the black magician." And at that moment the door opened, and in came another old man, exactly like the first, except he was dressed in white. It's like Gandalf the Grey and Gandalf the White. Isn't it funny how Saruman was the white? But even though he was wearing the white, he was affiliated with the black, right? The black magic. At that moment the door opened, and came another old man, exactly like the first. He was dressed in white, and he said to the white magician, "I need your advice." But threw a sidelong questioning glance at the dreamer, whereupon the white magician answered, "You can speak freely, he is an innocent." And the white-clad black magician related the story. He had come from a distant land where something extraordinary had happened. The country was ruled by an old king who felt his death near, and therefore had sought out a worthy tomb for himself. And there was a great number of tombs in the ancient land, and the king had chosen the finest for himself. According to legend, it was the tomb of a virgin who had died long ago. The king had caused it to be opened in order to get it ready for use. But when the bones were exposed to the light of day, they suddenly took on life and changed into a black horse, which galloped away into the desert. The black magician had heard the story and immediately set forth in pursuit of the horse, and after a journey of many days in the desert, he reached the grasslands of the other side, and he met the horse grazing, and there he came upon to find the account of which he now needed the advice of the white magician. What he had found was the lost key of paradise, and he did not know what to do with him, and his dream ended. So the tomb was obviously haunted by the spirit of the virgin, who played the part of the king's anima. Like the nymph in Malvasius, she was forced to leave her old dwelling place, chthonic and somber nature, to show her transformation to a black horse, kind of demon of the desert. We have here the widespread conception of the anima as a horsewoman in a nightmare and an ungodly spirit, and at the same time the well-known fairy tale motif of the aging king whose vitality is at its end. The life-renewing marriage with the nymph seems well planned, for in paradise the garden of love and the apple tree are opposites united. It's like immortal Merlin's marriage with this fairy. He will make her wildness like Eden, and her desert like the garden of the Lord. And there the wolf shall dwell with the lamb, and the leopard shall lie down with the kid, and the calf and the young lion and the fawnling and the young child shall lead them, and the cow and the bear shall feed, and the young shall lie down together, and the lion shall eat straw like the ox, and the suckling child shall play on the hole of the asp, and the weaned child shall put his hand on the cockatrice's den. Therefore the white and black come together in a kingly marriage. So here we have the conjunctio, right? The white dove, the black raven appear at the wedding. And let's see what Edinger here it says to this. Paradoxica. This is 81. So he's talking about so here we have the tree of knowledge of good and evil. For this image, Jung supplies the profound amplification of the passage from Isaiah, which speaks of the messianic age, where the opposites shall be reconciled. The wolf shall be with the lamb, and the leopard shall lie down with the kid. The messianic age, the coming of the self, is reached after the death of the old God image, after pursuing the dark horse of the passions into the desert. In other words, it follows a consequence of the exploration of the unconscious. In the process, there is a reconciliation between the light and dark aspects of the deity, the two aspects of the magician himself. And so a great deal more could be said about that dream, but it gives you some hint as to why Jung quotes so many times and why he considers it so important. And in talking about the archetypes of the collective unconscious, Jung says it's hard to understand nature sometimes. Why would he give this innocent fellow a dream like that? But then Jung says he was listening and he got what it meant. So it's easy to see the Jung theology student was functioning as a kind of agent by which nature communicated with Jung. Somebody was listening to it and the dream was not lost. Okay, so here we have Jung, again, grounding himself as a psychologist. But again, I want to stress like the reading of these as a occultist as well. So the idea here is, yes, there is a psychological idea here about reconciling of the black and the white and the reconciling of the black horse. But I think it's interesting to see 268. I think it's interesting to see that the magical aspects of this are also interesting, right? So here we have the Eucharist and the art of alchemy. This is a study that is done by Crowley here. One of the simplest and most complete of magic ceremonies is the Eucharist. It consists of taking common things, transmuting them into divine things, and then consuming them. So again, like we have with Christ's Eucharist, it's a transformative act, right? So as far as every kind of magic ceremony, the reabsorption of the force is a kind of consumption. Take a symbolic substance, symbolic of the whole course of nature, make it God, and then consume it. The highest form of the Eucharist is that which the element consecrated is one. It is one substance and not two, not living, not dead, not liquid, not solid, not cold, neither male nor female. The sacrament is secret in every aspect, in every respect. For those who may be worthy, although officially recognized, the Eucharist has been described in detail without concealment somewhere in the published writings of the Master Therion. The altar is the bosom of Isis, the eternal mother. The chalice is the cup of Our Lady of Babylon herself. The wand is that which is and is to come. The Eucharist of two elements has its matter in the passive. The wafer may be complex, a cake of light described in the Liber Legis. And here we go into the seven, right? 7 sacraments here. This is the exotic mass of the Phoenix. The Eucharist of 3 elements is the basis of the 3 guanas: tamas, darkness, rajas, activity, and sattva, calm. The cakes of light may be suitable. The Eucharist of the 4 is fire, air, water, and earth. The Eucharist of the 5 has the basis wine for taste, a rose for smell, a flame for sight, the bell for sound, the dagger for touch. So these are the senses. So again, maybe the 4 to the 5 is including the senses. The Eucharist of the 6 has Father, Son, Holy Spirit above, breath, water, and blood beneath. This is for high initiates, and the Eucharist of the 7 is identified with that of the 1. The method of the consecrating the elements is one necessary to be treated as talismans and is a key to magic. So so I think that what's interesting here is how things can become symbolic. I mean, just like the idea of laying out books on a table can introduce us to not only these symbols that they have that relate to kind of the story of something, but it just goes to show that part of Jungian work that served psychology was very different from the part where he was actively exploring the mystery. So here we're going to do something that's kind of funny, but I think it kind of proves the point. And what I've got here is a dream from a friend of mine. A friend of mine sent a dream across. It's actually from his brother that he's no longer with us, but I thought this was a fascinating dream, and I've got Dr. McCoy and Mr. Spock on the board. So here's a ultimate Mysterium Coniunctionis, right? Not Kirk and Spock. Spock and McCoy, sort of the head and the heart, right? Dr. McCoy, for you guys who don't know Star Trek, Dr. McCoy was the very emotional, reactionary human character, and Mr. Spock was the Vulcan. He was rational. And this was a sort of an interesting pair in the Star Trek lore. But this dream, which was sent across, so my friend's brother said this. It was, dude, I just need to tell you about this dream I had. It had to do with the nature of intellectual intelligence and biomechanica. It was a conversation between Mr. Spock and Dr. McCoy, of all people. It was a fast dream in real time, and I believe because it had traces of what I call dream compression. Now, one thing I want to call out right here was whenever we read about dreams, let's think of the two Jungs. There's the Jung who is the psychologist and the Jung who's the occultist, okay? So when we're reading this dream, I want us to put aside the Jung as the psychologist. So, for example, we'll read this dream. We know that it has to do with Spock and McCoy, and we can already say, oh, it's going to be a conflict of a person between his rational and his emotional states. Maybe this person has some emotion thing from his father complex or a parent complex. We could go into all that complex, so we're not going to do any of that. That's the realm of the psychologist. But Jung as an alchemist, Jung as an occultist, we have a very different reading of this, and it almost reads like a Dolores Cannon kind of text. Dolores Cannon being the person who she writes about hypnosis to reveal sort of extraterrestrial encounters. So let's go through this dream. But again, it talks first of all about a dream compression. So the dream compression is time is being altered. So we have a time altering mechanism that happens in the dream time. Right? Again, the dream time, which happens when one sleeps in the tomb of sleep, right? And it's a chthonic thing. It's a Saturnian force, right? It's a black sun force like this. So anyway, Spock and McCoy are arguing nicely. And what's nice about Spock and McCoy is it makes it very lighthearted. You know, we think of this as like, oh, Crowley, the Satanist, and Jung, he was a crazy psychologist, or the Manichaean heresy, or good and evil. All of these things seem very heavy, right? But if we reduce it to Spock and McCoy, the opposites are very light. And this is what Lacan used to talk about this in his L schema, about we can approach this very dire topic of tomb and womb. It seems very beyond, you know, the nation of tomb, womb, life and death, necromancy. It seems very like dark, right? But if we ease into this topic, and what the dreamer here has done for himself, his unconscious has given him two kind of friendly psychopomps, just like Jung would have Philemon, his imaginary philosopher friend who he would consult with in his dreams. Our dreamer, my friend's brother, who's no longer with us, but he lives on through this great dream. His unconscious gave us the funny pairing of psychopomps Spock and McCoy, who are about to tell us about UFOs, okay? So let's kind of go into this. Anyway, Spock and McCoy are arguing nicely over the topic of technology and how it has interfered with natural human development. Mr. Spock was arguing the point that because of technology, humans have not and will never reach the apex of their potential in an outwardly omnidirectional way. That is, fully developed of all its facets and equally strong in all those facets. Hence my new term, outwardly omnidirectional. Spock's main point that Dr. McCoy would either not get or not expect that humans have been disqualified themselves from some kind of evolutionary universal property exists in all living things. So the idea is Spock is saying humans have been limited in their ability to develop a general, what he calls an omnidirectional sense of their place in the world. A magical place in the world, one might even say. And McCoy, sort of as a humanist, says, nah, that can't be true. Nah, that can't be true. Technology isn't interfering with our progress. He doesn't want to believe it, right? He doesn't feel like it's right. Spock's main point that Dr. McCoy would just either not get or not accept was that humans have disqualified themselves from some kind of evolutionary universal property that exists in all living things. It was a very spiritual concept, but it had the weight, merit, and irrefutability of proven laws of science in the physical world. So in the dream space, this dream had acted like a proven law of science. The conversation took place between the two men in what was a cross between the old TV show Science Room and one of the rooms out of Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan. In front of one of those classic three-dimensional chessboards, Mr. Spock was doing most of the talking, and McCoy just sat on the edge of whatever appeared to be the lunch table. The context of the idea is that Spock was trying to get across to Bones, McCoy, is that computers have been doing humanity's calculating for them for so long they've simply surrendered the job to the machines. And in doing so, they have caused an unstoppable chain reaction where because of X, Y, and because of Y, W, and because of W, R, etc., eventually, this was what causes humanity's tragic and grimly permanent disqualification from this glorious process of natural evolution. Or let's kind of term it in what Jung was looking for is the integration, right, of the opposite, the oppositorium, right? You want to be the integrator of the oppositorium, but instead the technology is allowing us to continue to divide. And again, we're going to go back to the difference between a X, which demarcates sections, science, religion, spirituality, neuroscience, something like this, psychology, something like this, as opposed to a system in which a space is opened up, attention is created, attention with the equal amounts of torsion and suspension that allows for a field of discourse to explore these areas, right? Which I would say is a non-technological technique, right? Maybe this is what the Vulcan idea is, right? So the context of the idea Spock was trying to get across to McCoy is that computers have been doing humans calculating for so long, they've surrendered the jobs to machines, and then there's a chain of events. And eventually this is the fact that causes humanity's tragic and grimly permanent disqualification from the processes of natural evolution. And the one line that Spock speaks out, as me, the dreamer, can hear the word for word as he's getting up from the three-dimensional chessboard is, and the answer is simple. There are no computers on Vulcan. So Spock says this amazing thing, there are no computers on Vulcan. And, however, remember dream compression. So here again, the dreamer is going back to this idea of dream compression. What I heard Spock speak and what the message was, there are two different things. So on this line, there are no computers on Vulcan when uncompressed reveals this. When the Vulcan race underwent this evolutionary transformation, there were no computers on Vulcan because it took place so long ago they had not yet been invented. And also this process is so sacred and pure that it will not reveal itself to those who undergo it in the presence of unnatural things. Thus, things man-made from technology. Pretty weird, eh? So yeah, so here we have this concept. Let's unpack it again one more time. The concept here is there's an ancient technology that's not computer-based, that's not mechanical-based maybe, but it's intuition-based. It's an intuitional kind of machine. So when Spock says there are no computers on Vulcan, that means, like in the Dune saga, the Dune saga has shown us the idea of humans developing without machines. There was a law against machines, and sort of humans have existed without this, right? So I think we can similarly follow that the ancient Vulcans realized, like say Greek logic, and they didn't have a broken hegemony. They actually went further and further in this knowledge until they were the thinking machines, right? And then also, so there's two. So there are no computers on Vulcan when uncompressed reveals two things. The Vulcan race underwent this evolutionary transformation. There were no computers on Vulcan because it took place long ago before they had been invented. And also the process is so sacred and pure that it will not reveal itself to those who undergo the presence of unnatural things. Well, I think this is very interesting because at the same time, I do believe, and you can check this out in some of the works that we talked about. Like so I think for topic one, we did talk about the Cat 2 Journals out of Lovecraft's Providence, which I think sits like a grimoire of these kind of intersections of Mysterium Coniunctionis, Crowley, using Lovecraft. I think it's in that vein of Peter Levinda or even the works of David Beth and Arthur Moreau, so those kind of things, although this was written before any of those books were read. But there's also our book, Alchemy and Anthroposophy in the Dune Saga, where things like the Bene Gesserit, the Bene Tlilax, the Mentats are explored. So this is another book. You can find both of these books in our bookstore. And lastly, there's August Moldenhauer, William Mitchell's Artificial Psychoanalysis of Desiring Machines, which I think is the wheelhouse of this topic that we're talking about. It really blends the idea of alchemical thinking with the rise of artificial intelligence, and just also the idea that a kind of artificial psychology will be required, both for humans and human-machine interaction. So these are a couple of books. You can check these out in our bookstore. Link below helps to support the podcast and the channel. Hope this was interesting for you guys. As usual, leave your comments below. I will continue this Mysterium Coniunctionis. We're going into the personification of the opposites next time. We did have a little bit of this opposite with Spock and McCoy, something different just to liven it up. I will kind of move into some of these topics. I'll also want to describe next week some of the opposites about academia. In my, I was a student of Carl Jung. I'll talk about the classics department of Boston University in the late 90s, so I'll tell you about that a little bit. And thank you guys for listening. Talk to you soon. And check out our Patreon, check out our liking and subscribing. Share this. We're trying to get up to the maximum number of subscribers here to be more integrated with the YouTube algorithm, speaking of the machine. So yeah, what did you guys think? Leave your comments below. Interesting to get some feedback. And we will talk to you next time. Thank you very much. Hope everyone has a great week. And share your ideas. Thanks for listening. Bye.